Welcome to the University of Denver's Oral History. Our series begins in the mid-1980s when DU was literally on the brink of bankruptcy and continues to 2014 with the university a regional academic leader poised for national prominence, a remarkable transformation by any measure. The interviews in this series present a panorama of progress against steep odds. It's a remarkable series of stories told by men and women who were personally involved in saving the university and undertaking an extraordinary process of renewal. Their narratives are a true Renaissance tale. To continue our story, I'm joined by Daniel L. Ritchie, the University of Denver's Chancellor Emeritus. Dan Ritchie served as Chancellor of the university for some 16 years, from 1989 to 2005. If there's any single individual who can be credited with DU's rescue and renewal, what I call DU's Renaissance, it's Dan Ritchie. Although Dan would probably deny that and be quick to say that it was the work of many people, which is true, but it was his leadership that saved DU and began the rebuilding of what is now the University of Denver. Dan Ritchie, welcome to DU's Oral History. Dan, nobody was more deeply involved or played a more significant leadership role in saving and rebuilding the university than you. There's so much to talk about, but I'd like to begin by asking you to share a bit about your background before coming to DU. And maybe we could start about where you grew up, your family, and some experiences that might have shaped you as a young person.
Well, as you can tell from what you know, I'm mostly lucky, as you'll hear from what I'm going to say, I guess. And indeed, it was a team effort. I happened to be the lucky person, the right person, perhaps at the right time. And but it turned out much better than I was expecting, actually. Anyway, I was raised in a small town, a little mill town in the Piedmont area of North Carolina called China Grove. My mother and father were, this was I was born in the beginning of the Depression, so at tough times, there were times when we couldn't afford meat to eat, except maybe once a week, and so things were pretty tough when I was young, but there were wonderful folks. My father was a farm machinery dealer. He had a little dealership in a small town. At any rate, I think this story should probably begin when I was 15. I went to my father and told him that I was dropping out of high school, that this was a waste of time, it was boring and useless. I didn't ask him, I told him. Whew. But that's a 15-year-old kid, I guess. At least it was me. Unfortunately for me, my father said, "Son, we'll find you a school that is worthwhile and you'll find challenging and interesting." And we found a private school in Virginia by the name of Woodbury Forest that we couldn't afford, but I didn't know that till years later. And I thought, oh my goodness, what did I do? But anyway, that really changed my life. Before going there, I probably didn't know there was such a thing as Harvard University, much less thinking about going there. And I learned all sorts of things. I loved it. And it has remained a warm memory, I guess I'd say.
And it really changed your life.
And it really changed my life. Yeah. And it allowed me to apply to Harvard and to MIT. I got into both with scholarships offered and decided I would go to Harvard because I wasn't sure I wanted to be an engineer like my father. That's a typical son thing to do. And so Harvard was, again, an opening of my eyes and mind that I didn't really have any idea what I was getting into. I just thought it was a good idea. Anyway, again, to my surprise, my freshman year, I was elected the chairman of something called the Harvard Freshman Union Committee. of 40 students, which really managed the social things and if there were food issues or whatever. I was surprised at my success, and I don't still quite understand it, I think. But in any event, we did very well, and among other things we did that the university had never seen done by freshmen before, got into academic matters.
Oh.
We collectively decided that what was being taught in our the required basic courses for everybody needed to be rethought, and actually we got it changed, and believe it or not, I was invited and had lunch one-on-one with the president of the university, James Bryant Conant.
Oh, my.
And I got to where, this is just normal, of course. But anyway, then I think as a result of our success there and my somewhat notoriety, my sophomore year I was asked to head something called the Harvard International Activities Committee, which had been founded by Henry Kissinger when he was a graduate student there a few years before. And we were given kind of an open, what we can do, whatever seems to be something we need to do.
And this was your second year at
This
Harvard?
was my sophomore year, yes. And among the things we decided to do was, one, to bring over German student leaders to the U.S. because we had learned that in German universities, at the time, and this was not long after World War II, of course, that there had arisen a number of militaristic societies as they had had before the war, and that the students were they would cut their cheeks with a sword to show they were, and so on. Anyway, we heard about this and decided something needed to be done about it. And you can't learn about America and, wow, this is a better idea by books or whatever. Yeah. So we thought bringing student leaders over to study at American universities was a good idea, and that we ought to get that done. So we didn't realize we can't do that. Yeah. And, but we needed money, of course, so I went to the university first and asked for some money to help us do it, and they did help us, but that wasn't enough, of course. So we went to Carnegie and asked for more money, and they gave us more money, but that wasn't enough either. So does this sound like fundraising to you?
It does sound like fundraising.
Yeah, and anyway, then I went to the State Department and asked for money and explained that we could do things they couldn't do that needed to be done. And did they have some money they could help us with? And they said, no, but maybe we have a friend who does. So they introduced us to the CIA, which gave us the necessary money to finish the job. And later the CIA, quite a few years later, they were accused of seducing students. But the media didn't realize it was the students who seduced the CIA.
Right.
At least we thought. Now in hindsight it looks that way. But anyway, that worked. And the other project was to help students in Indonesia overthrow the government of Indonesia, which was a dictatorship that was really doing bad things to in education, they felt. Anyway, they succeeded in overthrowing the government of Indonesia, and but the new government wasn't much better, so it was, in retrospect, it was probably a waste of time.
Now, you went on to graduate school at Harvard as well, right?
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, I can, but I have something more, if I may,
please,
to add about Harvard. As a result of these things I was telling you, I stopped going to class. I had a full-time assistant, And this seemed like more important than college. And anyway, and I stopped going to, among other classes, intensive Russian. And I was about to be thrown out of the university, I think. This would have been early April. One morning, there was a knock at my door, my 5th floor walk up at 7:30 in the morning. I was sound asleep. And I went to the door, and there was Professor James B. Munn, who was one of the top people in the university, out of breath at the door. I thought, oh my goodness, somebody must have died in the family or something. Anyway, I got him some instant coffee, and he sat down, caught his breath, and said, "You haven't been going to class." Pause. And I said, "No, sir. But, sir, I'm just about to start." And he said, "There will be a tutor at my house every afternoon at 3 o'clock if you'd like to come." That saved me. I graduated from college.
Oh, my gosh.
But without that, I probably would not. So
what a story.
I have a lot of gratitude for a lot of folks, my father and others, that I felt. That really changed my life and saved me, really.
Really?
Anyway, sorry I talked
No.
too much.
But then you did go on to graduate school.
Yes.
And tell us about that. How did you find Harvard Business School?
Well, I applied to both law school and business school and got in both, but decided again that I didn't want to be a lawyer.
Mm-hmm.
I spent the previous summer in a law office and decided that was interesting and all, but I didn't want to spend the rest of my life doing that. Mm-hmm. So I went to business school, and again, I graduated.
Now, from business school, many people know about your work here at the university, but tell us a little bit about your business career, which was pretty extensive.
It lasted a long time, yeah. First I went in the Army. I was drafted and went in the Army, and for 2 years, and at what was called Machine Records Unit in Chicago, of the Army there. And after that, I went to work for Lehman Brothers in New York when it was a partnership, and Bobby Lehman was the senior partner. It was a wonderful place. It was very good to me. I learned a lot, of course. Wall Street is a different kind of a universe than I was used to also. Then I had made a lot of money for the founder of MCA, Music Corporation of America, Jules Stein. And one day he asked if I would come to work with him in Hollywood. MCA at the time was the leading talent agency in the whole world. Just about everybody you ever heard of at that time were represented by them. But I told Mr. Stein that I felt Lehman hadn't gotten their money's worth from me yet, but I thanked him. But a year later, he went to Bobby Lehman and asked if he could speak to me about and invite me, and he agreed, and I went to Hollywood.
So you went to Hollywood?
Yes.
And it sounds like a big change from Wall Street to Hollywood. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, they have things in common. I was a little uncomfortable in Wall Street, and I was more over the years. I worked for MCA, bought Universal Pictures, while I was there, and I had some role to play in that, and became the chief financial officer, but also executive vice president. I was on the board of directors of MCA Universal, it became.
And you met some interesting people, some pretty
Just
famous folks.
About everybody you can think of then. Had lunch with Walt Disney at his house, and the dinner that Alfred Hitchcock cooked at his house.
Oh my gosh!
And so it was great fun, but my problem was that Hollywood really wasn't me. Where if you were a star, you could get away with almost anything, and they did, more than the world realized. But I realized. And so it really wasn't me. They were very good to me. I made a lot of money, bought a house in Beverly Hills, and that had once been built for Elizabeth Taylor. It was really nice, but it wasn't me.
Now, you had a wonderful avocado ranch that I visited on the West Coast in Santa Barbara. Did you acquire that at that time, Dan, or later?
No, I acquired that and began the process of acquiring the cattle ranch here in 1977. It was only later that, because I left there at the end of '69.
I see.
And part of the time that I worked for MCA, they owned the Columbia Savings here. And I came here, and that was kind of my early testing by them, and ran it for a few years.
So you were running Columbia Savings here in Denver?
Yes.
And I assume that's where you began to meet
local
people.
The folks who talked me into going on the board at DU, yes.
And let's talk a little bit about the cattle ranch, and you and I have had a lot of experiences up there.
Yes. Talk
about it. It was such a wonderful place.
Yes. I really planned to be a cowboy. I really loved it, the life, the people, the scenery, the horses, even the cows, and I really planned to do that the rest of my life. I didn't plan to do something else, but and I put it together over many years, really. I think there were 22 transactions as neighbors came up, and as I could afford it, I kept adding to it.
And it turned out to be, as I recall, the largest cattle ranch in the mountains of Colorado.
Yes, by quite a bit. Yeah.
For folks who don't know, it ran from Kremling up to Muddy Pass, and then over to the Continental Divide, and then into Jackson County.
Yeah, no, that's correct.
It's a big ranch.
The deeded ground was almost 100 square miles.
Yeah. So then let's talk about, you mentioned coming on the DU board.
Yes.
So I guess my first question is, who connected you with, or what connected you to DU in the very first place?
What connected me was two people that I had met when I at Columbia Savings here, and gotten to know quite well. And I should mention that after Hollywood, I did go to Westinghouse Broadcasting, eventually to Westinghouse, and then to the broadcasting company, and then became the CEO,
You were CEO.
Of it. And it was during that time, 1983, and I went to Westinghouse almost 10 years before that. It was been 74, I guess. But I had met John Love, who was then governor here, and Al Cohen, who was prominent on the board there and had a cattle ranch, it turns out, as well in the mountains. So it was they who asked me to go on the board and came to see me in New York, actually. And I think they well, they knew I was planning to come back.
Yeah.
By that time, the people knew I was planning to come back to Colorado. So they wanted somebody, I think, on the board from New York, because we have a lot of,
Makes
or had
perfect
a
sense.
lot of people, of alumni there, and then the connections, I guess, in the broadcasting.
So you would have come on the board about 83?
83.
And tell me about your first board meeting. I mean, here you are, you're coming to Colorado, and
Yes.
How was it? What did you find?
It was a big surprise. It was in early June of 1983, and the Chancellor at the time presented the board with a budget for the following year, because our fiscal year ends at the end of June, and so this was 2-3 weeks before the new year, and the board was asked to approve a budget. And I was used to budgets and things. and so I asked, how are we doing this year? And so by comparison, and he didn't know how we were doing. They don't have the numbers. And well, I said, 10 months would be just fine, and compared to budget, and how was it? And I was surprised to hear that he didn't know the answers, and because I was used to having monthly figures of whatever I was responsible for coming within a week or two at most at the end of the month. And I said that I'm sorry I can't vote one way or another. I don't have enough to reject it or accept it. I just won't vote. And he said, well, maybe we could postpone this till this afternoon. It was an all-day meeting. His name was Ross Pritchard, by the way, was the chancellor at the time. And he said, let's see what we can come up with, so maybe you'll have something. Anyway, it came afternoon, he told us that we were we were about to run a deficit of $2 million, which in those days would be like 10 probably today. It was especially in this situation.
Yep.
And I was stunned, that we didn't know and nobody had asked. So the board did not approve and postponed having a budget. And at the end of the meeting, I went to my 2 sponsors and said, I have just resigned from this board. The man is either incompetent or dishonest, or both. And either way, I can't. I don't want to have anything to do with this. I'm sorry. I'm going back to New York. And their response was, let's see what we can do. And I said, well, as long as this man is here, I am not going to be. But they said, well, let's wait till it was the December meeting. I said, okay. And anyway, it ended up that he was given the option of resigning or being fired. And he refused to resign, and so he was unanimously fired.
And then he was followed by Dwight Smith.
Yes.
And that would have been in 1984.
Yes, I believe so.
But the university, we've talked to Dwight, and of course you know this very well, but the university was going through very difficult times. What was your sort of take on that as a board member?
You mean at this time? Or
yeah, no, as let's say in the mid to late 80s.
Okay. First, Dwight is an honest man. He is a nice man who cared about the place. but he didn't have the background of managing a complex organization. And so things were getting worse, not better. We were borrowing money to beat the payroll. And that is about all you need to know about. And we've been selling off assets to get by, and this was clearly a trajectory that was not sustainable.
Wouldn't sustain.
No.
So at that point, someone must have approached you about becoming Chancellor. Can you tell that story?
Do I have to?
I think so.
Okay. Yes. Well, I was planning to be a cowboy the rest of my life and maybe be on the board a while. And but I was getting very uncomfortable, actually, knowing where this was headed, and it said as much to the board. But one day, Bill Coors, who was vice chair of the board at the time, called me at the ranch and asked if he could maybe come up for lunch someday. So sure, I thought it was just a social thing, because we'd become good friends. He was a wonderful man who just passed away recently at 102. And we had many things in common, including our interest in wellness and mental and physical health. Anyway, so he came, and it was very pleasant until about dessert. and he asked if I would be willing to be Chancellor of the university. That we needed to make a change, then the board thought I should do the job. And my response was a long pause again. And Bill, I'm flattered, and I wish I could, but I'm just not qualified for that. I have no experience in that. And he was very smart, really, until the day he passed away, and said, "Dan, nobody's qualified for that." I thought, oh, okay, yeah, maybe. Well, so anyway, I said, well, let me think about it, Bill, and let me talk to some folks. So I talked to 3 people. One was Marion Gottesfeld, who was on the board and was one of my favorite people. Bill Daniels, who was a good friend, and the title was, I think, president of the University of North Carolina, the system of not
system
Chapel Hill,
president.
the system it was. His name was Dick Spangler. He and I were classmates at Woodbury Forest.
Oh my gosh!
And we remained friends over that time. And he also, by the way, became the richest man in North Carolina, which is a whole nother story in itself. And he's the one who was responsible for the Bank of America being brought its headquarters to Charlotte.
Oh my gosh!
Anyway, so he was quite a guy. So Marion told me, Dan, you need to do this. And Bill Daniels says, you don't have a choice. You got to do it. Oh. And then I called Dick Spangler, and I said, Dick, do you think I can do this? And his response was, Dan, if I can do it, you can do it. So I did it.
Well, so that you came on in, I guess, July of '89?
Yes.
And
Bill, of course, came up in May, so this would have been,
so shortly after. So when you came on as Chancellor, what did you discover? I mean, were things as bad or worse, or what did you find?
Things were at least as bad as I thought. What I also didn't fully appreciate before is that the student applications and new student numbers were declining fairly precipitously. And so we were really in trouble. And I thought, gee, I can probably fix the the financial side for a while, but we've got a bigger problem here. The campus was not being properly maintained. The faculty were unhappy and worried, and some were thinking of departing. So it was, the more I got into it, the more, but my big problem in my mind is that the faculty really, do they have any confidence in me? I was known for a while as our first cowboy chancellor, which I don't think was meant as flattery. And so there was that confidence issue that worried me, and also why I thought maybe I could fix the financial things, but I can't fix the academic and cultural issues.
And then shortly after you became chancellor, you invited me to join the university as the chief financial officer. And one of the things that struck me was what seemed to be a clear vision that you had for the university. We were up to our neck in problems, that was for sure.
Yes.
But you seemed to have a pretty clear view of where you wanted to take the university, not in a detailed sense, but in a broad sense. You talk about your thinking at that point?
Yeah. This is going to sound a little crazy, if not a lot. First, I really believe if you're going to do something, you do it really well. It's about, we had, when we started our strategic planning, we felt we were a Chevrolet and maybe we could get to a Pontiac. But my view had always been, gee, we can do a lot better than that. We've got to set our sights on quality, and also that each student is a unique person, that one size doesn't fit all in automobiles, and it certainly doesn't in young people. So it was a very different idea, but also it was based, which some other folks on the board agreed, that it's also about character. That character is more important than high school grades. That in life, that's really what it's all about. One of my favorite quotes for a long time has been a quote by Einstein, which is, he said, most people believe that that a great scientist is possible by intellect, but he said they're wrong. It's made by character, and now that I've been involved in that area, he got it right. And so the cowboy code of ethics was really sort of my foundation, and I happen to have in my pocket, which I always do somewhere here, I think I do, yes I do, may I read it? Would that be crazy?
Please do.
No, because this is, it's the cowboy ethics.
And this is from the book.
Yes, and I knew the author going back to my cowboy days. Anyway, live each day with courage. Take pride in your work. Always finish what you start. Do what has to be done. Be tough but fair. When you make a promise, keep it. Ride for the brand, which I really believe in too. Talk less and say more. Remember that some things are not for sale. And finally, know where to draw the line. And those were the things that literally I was thinking when these were the principles. If we were going to do it, that's, because I didn't want to do it just to do something,
Right.
but to make a difference in people's lives, as people had made in my life. And really my motivation behind all this was the stories I've told you, that what people did for me,
Right.
you know, that without whom I would not have done anything.
Now, you during your tenure as leading the university, a number of things happened, and we'll cover a number of those. But the most visible to the community are the wonderful buildings, the campus change, which for those of us, and it included many folks from Denver who saw the change, it was almost unimaginable.
To me as well.
Well, so, and that was something that you undertook early on. There were a
Yes.
lot of other things, we'll talk about those. But what led you to the decision that the physical aspects of the campus were an important thing to begin on?
Well, as I said earlier, everything was a mess. The buildings were not maintained. The old science building literally had both bats and rats that the students saw.
Did.
And the old library was falling apart, and Carnegie Library, and the lawn was
Hardly a lawn.
was really not. There were big bare spots, and
Right.
there was trash all around. And the first thing you see is the physical things.
Right.
And as I went around to the great universities, which I did, which is another story perhaps. Well, for example, at Duke, I spoke there and lectured, and I didn't see a piece of trash anywhere on the campus. I couldn't believe it. I thought, yay, you know, because, you know, if there's trash, it says something, and people throw more trash because everybody does it. So it was a matter of, it was an essential ingredient to solve all these problems if we're going to get the rest done, because it does set, if you go to Harvard or Duke or Yale or whatever, or Colorado College, you know, the buildings are good, but they're different from buildings in other places. They are not like, college campuses don't look like City Hall or a commercial building or whatever. They have a unique quality of character and are rooted in history. You know, you know, if you want to build buildings that look like they were built in the year you build them, in 20 years they'll look old-fashioned and cheap. And so, anyway, that sort of is what you wanted to
Well,
know?
I well remember, because I was working with you, when you said we were going to build buildings of the highest quality, buildings that could last 300 years. And at first people thought you were kidding until they saw the buildings. But you've touched on this a bit, but what led you to the notion that we really needed to create such extraordinary buildings? Was it reflecting a set of values, or what was your thinking?
No, I think, oh, well, let me put this right. I've always believed in first-rate buildings. If you're going to do something, do it first-rate. And I came across an architect, Cab Childress, who shared my beliefs and who had a great talent, but also knowledge of architectural history and so forth. And so we were a natural partner. I had tested him out. He did my house up for the cattle ranch. And it was gorgeous, really, and was not wildly expensive, but done really, really well, out of stone, as I wished. So that gave me some confidence. But the tower part of all this, the first building that we really worked on, where we had we now have a tower, which the Sports and Wellness Center that the board named for me when I was out of the room, we hadn't planned a tower. And Marion Gottesfeld and Joy Burns both said, Dan, this place needs a tower. It does. Okay. So we scratched around the world, looked around the world, for some months to find a model that seemed to work. And we couldn't do it. We looked at, I think, more than 100 different things. And we still couldn't come with something that worked with the style we had in mind. Until one day, Cab Childress said, Dan, what is your favorite building in all the world? And I knew that before. I didn't have to stop and think. It was the cathedral at Chartres. And I said, the cathedral at Chartres. He said, do you mind if I go look? So it would be okay to take a trip to Chartres? Oh, well, I guess so, Cam. And so this tower is different materials, but the proportions and the shapes and so on are really very close to the North Tower, the earlier of the two front towers of Chartres. And it is, and we tried changing dimensions and proportions, and doesn't work. So that's, and then that was so successful, and there are a lot of stories about that tower that I could tell sometime, but probably not today. That led to others, that everybody thought that, and indeed, if you go to Harvard, there are towers all over the place. Right. Lowell House, where I lived, and Eliot House, and Dunster House, and so that's how it all happened that way. Wonderful. Yeah.
And it's become a signature for the university.
No, it has. Yeah,
it really has.
And it's fun.
It's interesting to note that on the Sturm College of Law, on that tower, there's a clock that's got a kind of an oval shape. Is there a story to that you want to tell?
No. There's a story. Do I want to tell it? I don't think so. No, it was not my idea, but I have a watch. I wear still that is shaped like, see if you can see it. I don't know, can you? Mm-hmm. That's shaped like the clock here. And they designed it that way. And at first I didn't connect the two, but that's where apparently they got the idea.
It's a wonderful story. Well, so DU is building these buildings, and as we both know, they were not inexpensive to construct.
No.
And that brings me to the issue of fundraising.
Could I, before you go to fundraising,
sure, go ahead.
Could I talk about landscaping?
Oh, please do.
Because
sure.
It's really much more important than people realize, because you kind of take it for granted. But the landscaping, the brick walks, the curves in it, not too sharp, but curves, and the flowers where they are. There's a lot of art and science actually in designing a garden that the Japanese and the Chinese and the English and so on have learned about how to do it. And where the flowers are placed, the colors that you use when you use them and how you do them together, the texture of the things, and the relationship between the grounds and the buildings, how they're organized and what is between them. All of these are really important. I once, really twice, made a trip to Japan to look at gardens there. And I made one trip to see one garden on the west coast. It's of Japan. It's in Kanazawa, and Rokuen is the name of the garden. That is just stunning, but it's a composition. It was seriously how the trees, where the trees are, what kind of trees, the flowers, the water features. And I remember going there at dawn, or a little before dawn, and there was a woman there picking up leaves one at a time, and leaving the leaves that were still looking good, but picking up the leaves, and I cried because the whole thing was perfection. So and here what I did was to send our grounds folks, several folks from our grounds, to what I thought were the great gardens in this country. One was Longwood Garden in Pennsylvania, and the other was Winterthur, which was Henry DuPont's place in Delaware, because they're terrific, and how they use water and water flowers and so on, because it's not as simple as you might think, just planting grass. Anyway.
Well, no, your point is well taken, because when people look at our campus, it's not just a collection of wonderful buildings.
No.
It all works together.
No, that's right.
Yeah, and so thank you for raising
And how you divide it into different, and how they're different from one another. Anyway, it's a whole long story.
Well, not only do buildings cost money, but flowers cost money. So you really known as one of the most effective fundraisers that almost anybody knows.
I've had practice.
You've had a lot of practice, starting as a student, I see. But would you talk about the whole business of raising money? And I happen to know this story because you and I work together in these things, but how you went about it. How did you approach the whole notion of fundraising?
Well, first you need to be trustworthy. If people are going to contribute large amounts or small amounts of money, they need to trust you that you will do what you say you will do, that it is, and that you will involve them also in whatever it is, so they know before you do it what you're going to do. And also, people like to be involved with something that's really good, and it's one of the reasons for doing buildings of this quality. That, by the way, I also said I want buildings that'll be beautiful ruins in 1,000 years. Anyway, crazy. But people also want to contribute to something that is of quality and enduring. A good example, I think, is the Newman Center that Bob and Judy Newman and lots of other folks, Joy Burns and so on, gave us money for, the Gates folks. And there are a whole range of folks who did that. But anyway, when we first designed a building to move Lamont here from the other campus and create something special for that art, the estimate came in at $45 million. And we didn't want to borrow money to build a building where we would not make any money, but probably lose money. But I couldn't imagine where we would find $45 million. I mean, that would be like probably 150 today. That was 20 years ago.
Right.
And But then we decided that if we're going to do this thing, let's do it as well as it's possible that anybody knows how to do, whether we're talking about acoustics or whatever. And so we designed the current building, which is really 5 buildings separated by a few inches with acoustics that are really as good as there is in the world.
Right.
In fact, we brought over the chorus of London Symphony Chorus, to perform here, and they said this was the best place they had ever performed. And a few years later, they came back, mostly on their money, because they wanted to be here again. And they gave us Verdi's Requiem, which is quite a thing. Anyway, and the folks who did the acoustics said it was the first time in their 50 years that the owners of a performing arts building had not saved money by compromising a bit the acoustics. And so anyway, we raised every dime of the 67 million it took, and you can see the results. And so that is part of it. The other thing is that most people measure fundraising by the quarter, how are we doing, or by the year. I think you measure it by the decade. And because to be pushy about it or to be, I wouldn't do that. But also people really do appreciate not being pushed, I think. Mm-hmm. And we give you a couple of examples of people who left us their estates, who gave us like $100 a year every year. One was a school teacher who never made more than $40,000, who when she was young bought a duplex, traded that in on a fourplex, traded that in on an eightplex, and when she died she left us 3 apartment buildings. Another one was a senior lab assistant at CU, University of Colorado, and she was a genius at trading stocks. And when she passed away, we received $7 million. Neither of these did we know until just not long before when they knew they were going to pass away. Yeah. But we treated them never expecting anything like that, but as we would treat anybody with, listening to them and learning from them and getting them engaged, and we did that without expecting anything, really.
Right. And it was terribly effective, but as you say, at a pace that was appropriate.
Yes.
Without trying to.
So we got to do it this year, or whatever, but we wouldn't build a building until we had 80% of the money. That was our line. We didn't start building until we were at 80% right. of what would be needed to finish it. And that was the right number, and it's subsequently been followed by the Children's Hospital out.
It has, and in some cases we actually had a small endowment to help maintain the building.
That's exactly right.
We have much more to talk about beyond the buildings because you've been involved in so much, but perhaps we could just raise a couple of things in this session and then continue because there's much more. And I'd like to begin with what is DU's now famous study abroad program for students. We have been ranked #1 in study abroad in the entire U.S., and it was an idea that you raised. What led you to think about that and articulate it the way you did?
You bet. Well, I first became really internationally oriented, my story
Yes.
at Harvard. And the summer after that experience, I spent the summer on a bicycle in Europe. Through the UK, not the whole UK, through England, a little bit of Scotland, France, the Low Countries, cycled up the Rhine when everybody else was coming down, and ended up in Rome. And that really, it changed me, and changed my appreciation of the global picture, both economically, culturally, socially. Just learned so much. And so I, based on that experience, really more than anything else. Oh, and by the way, the only thing, I slept in ditches and under bridges, and I went to jail twice, but it was a really great experience. But the only thing I took with me, other than a blanket and a poncho, it was a book of Shakespeare's sonnets. So I got where I could almost recite
by memory. Well, it's had an enormous impact on students, and it was something that DU decades before had experimented with and then not followed through, and then you brought it forward, and it's had such a fabulous impact on our students.
Well, but what made it was the folks here, the faculty, who were committed to this. It was led by Vednanda and some other folks, and who did a splendid job of structuring it, making the deals with the right universities to be sure that there was a match here. Also, you need to stay with it so that if a university over there changed, or if there were risks to our students, or if a student had a personal problem in the middle of the night over here, there was somebody to talk to. So it was Ved and a lot of other faculty who went, and they made trips to each of these places to check out. And it was not just to go abroad to do some language or something.
Yeah.
It was to pursue in that country their degree that they had committed to. This had to fit in the quality and in general positioning of what they would have done here. So this was not easy to do, nor was it cheap. The problem is that we didn't raise the tuition,
right?
So we didn't get it to spend here. It was spent there, and then the trip back and forth and all the logistics that it took to support it. If I had been rational at the time, I probably wouldn't have done it. But I just believe in that there is no impossible dream. And this is one, because I really felt it was really crucial, because also the mission, which we haven't really finished, of my view at least, was to do this better than anybody else. I visited a lot of the best universities around the globe, and there's some more stories there. But decided, gee, we can do this. We can have a better undergraduate program than Harvard or Stanford or Princeton or name one, which seems like an impossible dream too, but I don't think it is.
No, I quite
and
agree.
I can explain why, but go ahead. We better break it.
Well, let me just touch on one more item, and then in our next session we can go deeper on some of these. But you focused on a number of things, but at the center of it, it seems to me, it's always been students.
Yes.
And you initiated a process of interviewing every student who applied to the University of Denver.
Yes.
And whether that student was in Maine or California or anywhere in between, a panel of people interviewed that student.
Yes.
That was a huge logistical
Yes.
matter. Why did you do that? What did you hope to achieve for ourselves and for the student?
Well, where I got the idea was a trip abroad in India and at the Indian School of Management in Bangalore, which was considered the best school in India.
Absolutely.
Maybe still is, I don't know. But they have a incoming class as a graduate of 300, and they did 10,000 interviews across India to fill that those 300 openings. And I talked to them about it. I said, "Are you crazy? Why in the world?" And you know, to do it as they did it all over India,
right,
which nobody had ever thought of doing before. And they said, "Well, really, it's simple. It's the only way you can make the right choices. That you cannot judge from test scores or recommendations or essays or whatever. You wouldn't hire somebody without meeting them and getting to know them. And we feel the same way about these positions, and there is no choice." So I called our admissions folks from India. "What do you think about this?"
Did they faint?
I thought they'd hung up. There was just silence on the other end. But we went forward with it. Usually there were 3 people, one doing the interviewing. One was a trained staff person, one was faculty, and one was an alumnus or an alumna. And that really worked and really changed things dramatically here. And I could give you lots of stories. But you can also use an algorithm to eliminate. I mean, if somebody on their test scores is so poor that they couldn't, no matter what, they couldn't make it or whatever, you don't go to that extreme. But so you can reduce the number sufficiently, and essentially that's what the Daniels Fund does.
Correct.
They do full interviews for everybody they give a scholarship to. And it's the same principle, that it's really about character more than anything else, and grit and determination and motivation, all those things that really make us who we are.
Right. Well, Dan, we have so much more to talk about in our next session. Outreach to the community, athletics, a major story we haven't even touched on, and we will approach all of those. But Dan, I want to thank you so much for contributing to the DU oral history, and needless to say, for your remarkable achievements here at the University of
But again,
Denver.
this was all of this, as you've heard, you know, and may I just say that one of the reasons I decided not to go away after 3 years was the faculty. You know, we had a much better faculty than I realized when I was on the board, because they did care about the students. And it's not, and I thought they'll reject me or whatever, but we really worked together and had a great time. And the faculty is really what makes all this work. And there's some stories there, but anyway, but I should say that.
Yes, indeed, and we'll get to some of those stories. Okay. So I hope you'll join us in the future as we continue the story of the University of Denver's remarkable renaissance. I'm Jim Grismer here with Dan Ritchie. Thank you for watching.